What
Yeah.
else have you been researching?
So obviously, I'm also quite interested in Bitcoin. That's definitely one of the areas of my areas of interest. I mean, I grew up. I studied economics in university, and I was always very interested in kind of the monetary policy side of things. I was what you might call a gold bug back in the day. So very big into the idea of the gold standard and how governments are screwing us over with their fiat currencies. Obviously now, I like
Glad
to
you
talk
said it.
more.
I'm glad you said it, not me. Do you think we are in a lot of trouble with fiat currency?
Well, my handle is the pragmatic investor, and that's kind of where it comes in a little bit, whereby, obviously fiat currencies aren't ideal, but I can't be just like Peter Schiff and tell people that the world is going to explode, every other year, because that's just not practical investment advice, is it? Because that hasn't happened, and I think that there's definitely a lot of nuance and whether you like it or not. I mean, I think the US dollar is here to stay a little bit longer, but that's not to say that something like Bitcoin, of course, decentralized, completely secure way of transacting and basically storing wealth is not something that you need. And obviously, I think it's an important asset to hold long term, but at the same time, I also lend myself a little bit to the idea that, of course, Bitcoin goes through those cycles. So I do like to trade through Bitcoin as well. And we did talk a little bit about our Bitcoin targets. I seem to remember you mentioning you had a kind of an idea about a triple top in Bitcoin. I'd love it if you could explain that to us a little bit now.
I get asked to, I shouldn't have said that because I get asked about that a lot, but I'm happy to share my ideas. This is the first cycle where we've experienced new all-time highs before the halving. I think it's pretty clear we have a lot of price manipulation by a lot of different stakeholders. We have people
Mm.
like Michael Saylor. Saylor is actually doing some type of, it's kind of like a legal Ponzi scheme where he keeps leveraging MicroStrategy. He borrows money from MicroStrategy, uh, puts up shares of MicroStrategy to borrow money, and then he'll buy Bitcoin. And because he's buying more Bitcoin, it pumps up the price of Bitcoin and it pumps up the price of MicroStrategy. And then he'll keep doing the same process over and over again. So he did that a few times when Bitcoin was at around 35,000, all the way up to around 60,000. So I think he played an important role in helping to get Bitcoin above previous all-time highs early. You have the SEC approving the ETFs. You have BlackRock, jumping in on the ETF. You have JP Morgan changing from bearish to bullish right around the time of the halving. A lot of people are getting excited around the time of the halving. This is the first cycle where we've broken previous all-time highs before the halving. And I think that's very strange. Based on what I'm seeing on the charts, it's an early rally. I don't think we are done rallying. I think we can see $100,000 Bitcoin this year, which sounds
Mhm.
insane, especially because me and you are talking about a potential crash in the second half of 2024. But one of the things that we've talked about is the black swan and how something has to give. Um, Usually the prices of everything rises before the crash. It's
Mhm.
kind of like a melt up a bit before the crash. So I think we could experience that. What I want to see from Bitcoin right now is for the price to close to reach around $80,000. That will give me the confidence that Bitcoin will just continue to run up. I think if we pass the new all time highs around 74,000, I think Bitcoin will just go on a run. But I think in a few months, something will happen. Either the Fed pivot, a recession, some type of black swan. I lean towards some World War scenario of some bearish news from war. We saw a few months ago with Iran and Israel, firing back at each other. Bitcoin kind of sold off a bit, dropped down to around 56,000, which
Mhm.
was the day that Iran attacked Israel, I believe. So I think war is affecting the price. I think we could see some surprise attack in a few months. That's kind of what I'm leaning towards right now. I do think we could completely sell off after a Fed pivot. But what I'm leaning towards is, if you're familiar with the Bitcoin rainbow chart, which I
Hmm.
showed you last time, if you connect, are you able to pull that up on your screen? If we rally up to the highs, if you compare my rainbow chart to the one that you showed, the tops are actually connected. So with
Right.
the one that you showed, if you go back to it,
Yeah, it's obviously, yeah, it's quite a difference.
so if you show the full
Yeah.
chart, on the left side, you see the peak just completely sticking out, multiple
Hmm.
peaks sticking out. That's not drawn correctly. It needs to be aligned. And then on the right, the peak isn't even, it's not even touching the top,
Right.
the red area. So it's way below. So it's just drawn very poorly. But if you go back to mine and you align it correctly, and this is a logarithmic uh, chart. And what
Hmm.
happens with the log chart is, over time, your return on investment is decreasing. What I'm concerned about is Bitcoin's product life cycle. I think over time, we are enjoying Bitcoin during the growth and maturity stage. I think there will be a time where Bitcoin starts to decline and actually start to lose value and lose adoption. That's one of my concerns. And I don't know when it will happen. It could happen. We could get one more cycle, another, like two more cycles. I'm not really sure. I think this cycle we are seeing some clear interest, but I don't think we can break through this resistance line drawn by the logarithmic trend line. So
Hmm.
anytime we touch the highs of this range, there will be a very strong sell-off. And this sell-off, it's really coming from the smart money. The last cycle, I knew about this trend line from the last cycle, but I was very confused because, for two reasons. We reached the logarithmic trend line very early, and
Hmm.
we had a 50% correction
Yep.
from around 60K down to 30K. And it was very confusing because Bitcoin had never done that before.
Hmm.
But this was also the first cycle where we had global adoption. And I think there is so much global demand for Bitcoin, uh, causing the rally, that we are likely to get an early run up, which is what we have been seeing. And we're rallying up to, the price target is around 126,000, based off what I'm seeing right now. So I think we could just continue to rally. And as you've been seeing, we just get more and more bullish news. Like we have now talks about an Ethereum ETF. So if the Ethereum ETF gets approved, that could cause Bitcoin to rally from 70K to 100K,
Hmm.
because the last ETF was approved. We rally from around 35K to 70K. So we can just keep getting more and more good news that helps us rally early. But as we've discussed, the macro situation is not looking too good. But everything aligns with an early rally because the Fed keeps on pausing, they keep delaying. Uh, Everything has stayed the same. We've kept interest rates the same for months and months and months. Every now and then they fluctuate between very hawkish and very dovish. I don't really buy into that. I stay, like you, a pragmatic investor. It's The narrative right now is April was an overreaction. Everybody was extremely hawkish. So I think we run up to 120K, drop down to 60K, run up to 120K again. Except the second run up would give us a higher target, probably around, with this log chart, over time the price target increases. So based off the first target would be around 126K. That's why the last cycle you had a double peak the first peak was around 65K, and the second, or I believe 60, it was around 62K, and the second peak was around 69K. So over time, the price target will increase. So my theory is, history repeats itself again. Last time we had a double top. I think this time there is enough momentum for three.
Yeah, that's certainly interesting. And I kind of agree that to an extent about everything you've been saying about obviously the demand and the good news that keeps coming in. But at the same time, kind of there's a little bit too much excitement, I think. And like you say, 1 million, I mean, to me, that can happen in a world maybe where obviously the US dollar has inflated so much that, obviously it now basically is worth a tenth of what it is now. But in itself, $1 million Bitcoin, let's say at the price parity of today, seems a bit ambitious. And I also think that that's kind of, why, in a way, I also believe that, we're going to peak, a lot earlier than people think. I have my own Bitcoin chart here. Obviously, now I like to do a bit of what they call Elliott wave analysis. So Elliott wave, basically structures the market into impulses of 5 waves, and then you get like your 3-wave retracement. That's kind of a little bit over the top. And then what you use, which I find very useful, is the Fibonacci extensions to reach different potential targets. Now, one way to reach a target, for example, is to take, for example, you take the length of your wave 1. So here, we've labeled this a wave 1 here from the bottom all the way to this kind of 31K peak. And then you measure that from the bottom of your wave 2. And typically what you see is you hit, and we did actually, if you can see here, that wave 3 right here, hit that 1.618 extension and pretty much reverse. It was a little bit shy perhaps, but still pretty remarkable. And of course, the 61.8% is of course the golden ratio. So that's always a very important one to look at. But basically the implication would be now that, you'd expect the wave 5 to rally at least towards the 2 extension, which I've marked here, but possibly also towards the 2.618 extension. And, Bitcoin does actually have, in Elliott wave terms, a tendency to have extended wave 5. So again, that is a range that I'm looking at. We can also see basically marked by this kind of trend line from the last 2 tops, that's also, kind of 100K is where that kind of gets us. So I think there's definitely a strong resistance at that 100K level. And again, I think it'd be quite interesting, because it never happens how people expect, right? When Bitcoin was selling off, everyone was saying, oh, it's going back to 10,000. Well, it never did. And now everyone's like, oh, it's definitely going to break above 100,000. I mean, how off guard would the market get caught if, it didn't even break above 100,000, which, I'm saying it's a possibility, I'm just saying. And of course, the other way you can do this is also if we measure all the retracement from the top we had, back in the cycle, you can see that actually it coincides quite well. We have the 1.236 extension over here, and also the 1.618 extension. Again, these would be two key targets in terms of Fibonacci extensions. So again, that 100 to 160K range, definitely one that I'm looking at. So again, I think that's definitely going to be an interesting development. But like you said, I think in general, you're going to see Bitcoin sell off with the market normally, although we have seen some instances where they break that, right? Especially, when we had, for example, the banking crisis, which of course is something that, I think is still a possibility. I believe it was either Sunday or Saturday, we had the SEC, news of the SEC saying that they would not be raising capital requirements for banks, which, might be bullish in the short term, but definitely doesn't bode well for the longer term. I think there's definitely some concerns there still with bank balance sheets. I think that, although we've swept some of that under the rug. So it could be interesting if we did see a banking crisis, we could, I believe, definitely see a breakup there of the maybe of the relationship. But the other one we've mentioned, and you just mentioned how it's kind of a Ponzi scheme, is MicroStrategy. But I mean, at this point, is MicroStrategy a buy? What do you think about that?
I don't own any MicroStrategy, but I think it's done very well. Saylor claims that he has outperformed Bitcoin. I think it's performing very well. I think it's a smart way to use leverage to buy more Bitcoin. I don't think Saylor is very good at timing his Bitcoin buys. I've seen him buy at, very high prices, but it's not an investment for me, especially at, the price of its shares. I'm more interested in the spot ETFs,
Hmm.
but right now, I think there is a higher return on investment with altcoins. So, like I said with the logarithmic chart, over time, Bitcoin has diminishing returns. So, I don't think this, especially right now, buying at 70,000 and selling at 120,000, you're not even doubling your money. So, it does not make too much sense if my prediction is true and we peak at 120K. But I think there are a lot of altcoins that are going to rally like crazy. And so I'm more interested in those. As far as I'm not too interested in Bitcoin stocks, but I know that you are. I think Bitcoin miners have surprised me a lot. So I was actually going to enter the Bitcoin mining business many years ago. And when I was researching it, it just sounded like a terrible business to be in, especially as new, better miners come out. You have to, reinvest in new inventory. Um, it costs a lot of electricity to run them. Things can go wrong. You're not really guaranteed to successfully mine Bitcoin. You have so much competition. So I never looked at mining as a great business. I think after the halving, there are a lot of questions, at least for me, whether miners can be profitable.
Hmm.
The mining reward, so far, I think it's been fine, but cutting the Bitcoin in half numerous times over, it's just become harder and harder to successfully mine Bitcoin. And with diminishing returns, I think what we saw is a lot of miners raised money right before the halving. They
Hmm.
diluted their investors. I believe Riot. I don't think I think Marathon raised money too, actually. So I'm not very bullish on miners, but I've been very surprised how well they've been performing. My brother-in-law, the Bitcoin Maxi, he's bullish on Marathon. He has some options on Marathon. I believe it's Leaps, but I don't know. I'm not. I'm not interested in miners. But how do you feel about miners?
Yeah, I think you make some good points there. I think, like you say, it is definitely a very hard business to be in. I think near the lows, I think a lot of the miners, in valuation perspective, were looking quite good. And on the other hand, and I had a conversation with a fellow essay contributor, Mike Fay, and this was back when kind of Bitcoin was getting towards the 70K before this kind of little sell-off. And that's when we saw the minus peak. And he very aptly said, look, now you look at the valuation and it's not enticing, and he actually, disclosed he was selling a big part of his position. But at the same time, I think I think there's definitely some good miners out there even now. I mean, we had a bit of a pullback, which was, I think, definitely viable when you had, stuff like CleanSpark, go back to about $15. And at the same time, I think it's a little bit like we were saying with other stocks. There's trading and there's fundamentals, and you need a bit of both. And I do think that obviously there's a lot of momentum that obviously I think if Bitcoin, as we think, is going to go to at least 100, 150K, I'd be very surprised if a lot of the miners don't, at least perform well. And I think there's an argument to be made that they'll perform even a little bit better, even a little bit better.